afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Homeland Security Today's Book Talk. I am Kristina Tanasichuk, the executive editor of HS Today, and we are so excited to talk with Mark Bailey today. And Mark is not only an HS Today contributor, but he was also one of 2023's 50 trailblazers for Homeland Security Today. But that's not why we have him. I mean, obviously, we already love him. But he is also an associate professor at the National Intelligence University, where he is the department chair for cyber intelligence and data science, as well as the director of the Data Science Intelligence Center. So he has published a book, or it's coming out, right? Unknowable Minds.
February 4th.
There you go. And so,
Yeah.
welcome. We're so excited to talk with you today.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's great to be here.
Yes, thank you. So he has been widely published, but this latest book is tackling really the biggest challenge we have, perhaps as the human race. I don't know if that's too broad or epic, but really AI and understanding how AI intersects on numerous levels is what Mark decided to tackle. So Mark, tell us why you decided to try and tackle that in one book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a vexing problem for a lot of reasons. AI. I had worked on a few different AI programs within the U.S. government and sort of became familiar with sort of the mission sets that we're trying to integrate AI into and leverage it for. I see AI as being inherently different than a lot of other technologies, maybe any other technology we've ever developed, in that it has sort of a fundamental component to it that's unexplainable. So I think a lot of our acquisition processes within government tend to, they tend to be predicated on this notion that technology can be inherently deterministic and inherently knowable in terms of how it's going to perform. So you test it in various environments and you assume that it's going to be reliable and predictable in those environments and as it sort of progresses through the acquisition process. But AI doesn't do that. So there's sort of a fundamental complexity to it that causes AI systems to make a lot of decisions or predictions that one wouldn't necessarily expect. And I think that's what makes it, sort of dangerous, I would say, for what I would consider to be critical problems, or if we were to use it for different types of like, things where if it failed, it could fail deadly or fail in significantly catastrophic ways. Um, so that's kind of what I wanted to encapsulate with this book and sort of give policymakers within government and within the national security space to kind of be able to think about these problems and reflect on what this means for the ethics of AI integration and what it means for sort of the limits of what we can know about technology.
So, in the book, you cover the risks, and I'm sure that you could really write a tome of encyclopedias about all the risks. We were kind of talking about decision trees, how many
Right.
branches, and how really for humans to figure out the decision trees for AI is virtually impossible. So, what are some of the biggest risks that you highlight in the book?
So I talk about, sort of I would say the ethical implications of not being able to know how AI is going to behave, and also the ethical implications of allowing AI to make decisions where you ought to really have a human making those decisions. So, one of the critical, like, I think the majority of the book focuses on lethal autonomous weapons and those sorts of, very critical types of AI decision making systems where, if you have an AI making a decision in a battlefield as to whether or not someone should live or die, that's kind of a big deal. AI doesn't reason ethically in the way that humans reason ethically. Even if you were to train an AI model on some sort of an ethics data set, perhaps maybe you have some data set as to how humans make decisions about ethics. AI is still not reasoning about ethics, it's interpolating that data. So it's not really cogitating on some of the implications, the moral implications of the decisions that it makes. And then I think, that has, I think, some implications for like notions of human dignity. And, that's really important in war, that you respect human dignity of all combatants in the battle space, because that I think has sort of a dampening effect on some of the more atrocious things that can potentially happen in war. So that's kind of that's one of the biggest issues that I try and talk about in the book. I think there are, but at the same time, I think, the whole point of AI is to is to increase the speed of action. I think that's sort of that's what people perceive as being the major benefit of trying to use AI in a lot of different applications. And I think there are some applications where that's appropriate, as long as there's a human in or on the loop at every decision point. So I think, in government, perhaps we can use AI for things like text analysis or like other types of things where just to kind of increase the speed at which you can do these types of tasks that don't have sort of critical failure implications. Even helping analysts label data is an important thing when there's so much data to go through. Then analysts can still look at the data and make some reasoned determination as to what the data means. And I think that's kind of where that's what I'm hoping to instill with this book is that we need to sort of find that balance because I think we can it's unrealistic, I think, for people to think, oh, we're just going to stop all AI development because I think the cat's already out of the bag in a lot of ways. So how do we do it in a way that's smart and that respects, our moral foundations as a nation and, and just sort of respects our shared humanity with everyone else that AI is going to, potentially influence. While at the same time, I would say, staying globally competitive because, we need to maintain sort of strategic advantage against adversaries, and they may not necessarily have the same, sort of the same considerations when it comes to AI integration, or they may just be different in terms of how they view AI's appropriate use.
Absolutely. Well, we are certainly looking around the world and looking at various ethical frameworks. Like nations have different ethical frameworks. So, if it's win by all cost, that's different than how we approach it. So, one of the concepts that you talk about is emergent behaviors. Can
Yeah,
you kind of define that and talk a little bit about it and why it's important?
absolutely. So one of my research interests deals with complexity, and complexity is sort of a framework for looking at different types of systems that have uh, what we would call emergent behavior. So these sorts of phenomena that kind of happen and they're not necessarily predictable in ways that are inherently, I would say, mappable to something deterministic. So and that might be so here's an example, right? So in physics, you might have, you can look at uh, different types of physical phenomena, like an object moving through space or something. And you can map it to some sort of a mathematical abstraction, some set of equations or laws that govern the behavior of that in a way that's predictable. And it's not a perfect mapping because the models that we have are sort of imperfect models of the world. And but it still gives you a pretty good idea as to what's really happening. Um, but you can also have systems that are inherently complex. So you can't use the same sorts of sets of laws to look at, say, an economic system and sort of infer the emergence or the emergence of a market or the dissolution of a market simply by looking at some set of equations and making some prediction about what's going to happen. It's a collective action that creates this kind of thing of all the different components of the economy, all the players within the economy that creates this market and it emerges. And the only way to really know that these sorts of things happen is to either have some is to either watch it play out in real time or to have some sort of a high fidelity simulation where you can gain some insight. But even if you have a simulation, you can't necessarily take that data and map it back to some sort of a deterministic law. And that's kind of how I view complexity and emergence. And AI being sort of an inherently complex type of system has these same sorts of phenomena. So AI is basically, in a lot of ways, an interpolation machine, and it interpolates a large data set to make some inference about something and makes predictions based on that. And when I say interpolation, I mean like if you have a simple example would be like fitting a line to some points on a graph. You can fit that line to those points, and then you can pull a slope and an intercept from that line and make some prediction about an interpolation as to what other points might be that aren't necessarily inherent in the data set. And and that's kind of, you can even derive some sort of physical meaning from those two parameters that you get from that line, the slope and the intercept. And you can interpret and understand sort of what it means. But when AI fits some sort of a model to data sets that have maybe billions of parameters, you can't necessarily extract those parameters and know what they mean. So there is sort of an inherent level of unknowability there. And that kind of contributes to the overall complexity of these systems and their inherent unpredictability.
Absolutely. And so many people probably got lost with even your slope intercept. Like there's so many things to understand there. So as
Yeah,
you approach kind of discussing this with policymakers and people who are not experts,
sure.
I think that's a really important kind of translation of extremely inherently complex things to simplify them so that anyone can understand and grasp the concepts. What are some of your pieces of advice for approaching AI, especially for policymakers?
I would say to approach it with what I would call epistemic humility, sort of humility about what we don't know and maybe even what we can't know, and not being so quick to say, oh, we're going to use AI to fix everything. We're going to invest tons of money into AI without any real consideration of the ethical and the safety issues related to it, both near term and long term issues. I think sometimes the discussion about AI safety it tends to hyper focus on the long term issues of AI, where people are afraid of like a Terminator type scenario or sort of like an AI singleton that enslaves humanity, those kinds of things, which I think are interesting problems to think about. But I don't think that's necessarily what's going to happen with it. I think we're going to see issues with AI just in its inherent complexity and how it interacts with itself, with it, like with other AI systems and with humans, and sort of the level of unpredictability that comes from that sort of confusion. Like I would consider it like sort of the fog of the AI universe. This sort of collective action of all these different very simple AI agents now making these decisions and predictions that we become overly reliant on, and we can't necessarily predict or understand why they're making these decisions. And then if something happens where you get some event that creates this sort of complex chain of events, and the entire system kind of shifts in a way that could be bad. So that's kind of like that's I think what the real short-term risk of AI is, and not necessarily like an AI singleton that takes over the world.
Well, we'll have to get Hollywood involved and have you talk to them about making a movie because that's kind of where all these concepts of these singletons and certainly, RoboCop and all the rest of it, where that all
Right.
comes from. So, yeah. Well, we really appreciate your time today. Your book is Unknowable Minds. We highly encourage our readers and our listeners to purchase the book through Amazon when it's ready. You can pre-order now, but you can't get your hands on it. And we look forward to hearing more from Mark throughout the year in columns and just commenting on more of his research and what he's learning about AI, so especially on behalf of Homeland Security and the security of the nation. So, Mark, thank you for your tremendous work.
Thank you, Christina. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome.